The world remembers Charlie Chaplin as the man who made us laugh without ever saying a word. A hat, a cane, a stumble, and suddenly the world's chaos felt lighter. But behind every silent grin was a scream he never voiced. Charlie didn't wear a costume. He wore a shield. The baggy clothes weren't comedy, they were camouflage. A way to exist in a world that never made space for his real voice. He was born into poverty, raised in hunger, and trained in survival. Before he ever stepped onto a stage, he knew what it meant to be forgotten. That's why he became unforgettable. He created a character the world would love, not because he wanted fame, but because he feared vanishing. The Tramp wasn't fiction. It was a mirror. He gave the audience what they needed so he could protect what he never had, safety. But no one asked what it cost him. No one wondered what happens to a man when the only way he's allowed to speak is by making others laugh. Charlie built a world out of gags and timing, but inside he was still the child who watched his mother lose her mind and his father drink himself to death. Every fall was real. Every laugh was an attempt to delay the silence. And deep down he knew, the louder the audience cheered, the less they saw him. They saw joy. He carried ache. But he kept going. Because sometimes making people laugh is the only way to prove you're still there. Charlie didn't discover comedy, he escaped into it. As a child, he would mimic people not to entertain, but to survive. When the rent collectors came, when his mother went silent for hours, when hunger twisted his stomach into knots, he performed. Not for applause. For relief. Because laughter, he learned early, could soften the edges of even the sharpest fears. It was a distraction. A disguise. A momentary spell that turned tragedy into rhythm. When others cried, Charlie danced. When they begged, he bowed. It wasn't courage. It was instinct. He wasn't trying to be loved, he was trying not to be abandoned. The stage became his shelter. The spotlight, his safest darkness. And the Tramp, that stumbling, smiling shadow, became the version of himself the world would accept. But beneath the bowler hat and mustache was a boy who hadn't stopped grieving. His mother had been institutionalized. His father was gone. And now, in front of the camera, he had to pretend that life was a comedy worth clinging to. That the fall was always followed by a rise. But Chaplin knew better. He knew that some people don't get back up. Some smiles never reach the eyes. And some laughter echoes too loudly because it's hiding too much. Still he performed. Still he gave. Because when you're taught that your worth depends on the joy you provide, you forget what it feels like to ask for anything in return. Even understanding. Even rest. Especially love. For Charlie, the show had to go on, even when it stopped feeling like his. Even when the fame came, the roaring applause, the global recognition, the immortality of film, Charlie never stopped feeling small. He stood on stages and shook hands with kings, but inside he remained the boy backstage waiting to be called. Waiting to matter. The world adored the Tramp, but they didn't know the man. They knew the stumble, not the sorrow. They quoted his jokes, not his journals. And maybe that was his deepest wound, that in giving the world his laughter, he erased his right to grief. Because people don't want their clowns to cry. They want the fall, the punchline, the bounce back. But what happens when the man behind the makeup has nothing left to bounce back from? Chaplin often wrote in silence. Letters he never sent. Ideas he never finished. Because the one thing he couldn't choreograph was how to be truly seen. He feared stillness more than failure. Not because he hated being alone, but because in silence the laughter stopped, and all that remained was him. Raw, haunted, brilliant, exhausted, and that terrified him. So he kept performing. Even off stage. Interviews became acts. Smiles became shields. And yet, somewhere deep inside he wondered, would anyone love me if I stopped being funny? That question never left him. Not at premieres. Not at parties. Not even in old age. Because the tragedy of Chaplin wasn't that the world misunderstood him. It's that they never thought to ask if he was okay. And he made it easy. Because pain is quiet. But laughter? Laughter is loud enough to drown everything. There's a strange loneliness that comes from being seen by everyone, and known by no one. Chaplin lived under a spotlight that made him visible to the world but invisible to himself. Everywhere he went, people smiled. They wanted a wink, a wave, a walk. They didn't want Charlie, they wanted the tramp, the icon, the escape. And so he gave them what they wanted. For years, for decades, until it wasn't a role anymore, it was a cage. One stitched together not by hatred but by admiration. Because the world's affection, though loud, was never curious. No one asked who he became when the makeup came off. No one stayed to see what silence sounded like once the clapping faded. And slowly, Chaplin learned something painful. Being loved isn't the same as being understood. He wrote screenplays full of heartbreak, of injustice, of human longing. But the world quoted the gags. They laughed at the stumbles and skipped the sorrow. Even when he made The Great Dictator, a film not funny but necessary, people asked when he'd go back to being silent. Laughter had become his prison. A beautiful one, but still a prison. And every night when the lights dimmed, he wondered, did they love me? Or did they just need me to keep smiling? He didn't resent them, but he mourned. Not for what he lost, for what he never got to show. As the world evolved, Chaplin watched the medium he once mastered begin to forget him. Sound came. Color came. New stars rose. And suddenly, the man who had made millions laugh with a tilt of the head now found himself irrelevant. Critics called him outdated. Studios hesitated. Younger audiences didn't recognize the silent genius. But the silence was never the problem. The problem was that the world only saw silence as absence, not intention. Chaplin wasn't mute. He was precise. Every gesture meant something. Every pause spoke. But in a culture racing toward noise, his subtlety became invisible. And that invisibility hurt more than hate ever could. Because he had never been arrogant. He had always listened. Always adapted. Always given. And now he was being asked to disappear gracefully. To make room. As if he hadn't built the room they were now decorating. But Chaplin wasn't bitter. He was bewildered. Bewildered that everything he sacrificed for the sake of connection had led him back to isolation. The same place he started. The same place he thought he'd left behind when he first heard the sound of laughter in a darkened theater. That sound had saved him. And now it seemed to have moved on. He didn't chase it. He didn't beg. But inside something broke. Not his pride, his hope. Hope that one day someone would watch his work and see not just a funny man, but a man who was always asking, "Do you see me now?" Even in his personal life, Chaplin struggled to stay whole. Fame had made intimacy complicated. He was surrounded by people, but few stayed long enough to hear his silence. He married. He divorced. He married again. Always searching, always trying to find someone who saw beyond the character. But that character was everywhere. In posters. In parodies. In memories too loud to erase. He once said, "I remain just one thing and one thing only, a clown." But that wasn't a confession. It was a surrender. Because being a clown meant people forgave you for hurting. For failing. For being broken. It gave him permission to hide. And hide he did, even from himself. He buried grief beneath productivity. Pain beneath creativity. And though he aged, the tramp never did. That eternal, smiling figure followed him into old age, a shadow he couldn't outgrow. And maybe he didn't want to. Maybe the tramp was his only way of still believing in innocence, in resilience. But the irony was cruel. The more the world loved that character, the more Chaplin disappeared. His art outlived his voice. His image eclipsed his truth. And as he sat in the quiet of later years, watching reels of his younger self stumble joyfully across the screen, he didn't feel pride. He felt distance. A deep ache that whispered, "They laughed with me, but did they ever listen?" That was the wound he carried, not of being forgotten but of being remembered for the wrong things. At some point, Chaplin stopped performing for applause and started performing out of habit. The gestures, once precise and full of purpose, became survival mechanisms. He no longer smiled to charm, he smiled to breathe. Because when you've built your entire identity around joy, sorrow becomes something you're not allowed to have. Not publicly, not loudly, and certainly not permanently. Chaplin was exhausted. Not from the work, but from the constant expectation to be more than he was. Funnier, wiser, timeless. He had become a myth, and myths don't get to rest. He watched younger artists rise and fall while he remained unmovable, iconic, lonely. The kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being unloved, but from being loved incompletely. People adored what he gave them, but didn't know how to hold what he hid. And so he kept moving. From country to country. From project to project. From one version of himself to another. Until he no longer knew where Charlie ended and the tramp began. He had given the world his best, and what remained was a man too complex for caricature, too fragile for legacy. He didn't want to be celebrated. He wanted to be allowed to be human. But the world doesn't let legends grow old, it lets them vanish behind their younger image. And that image, frozen in time, kept smiling. Even when the man behind it no longer remembered how. In interviews, Chaplin would often deflect deep questions with a joke. He had mastered the art of redirection, turning pain into poetry, tragedy into timing. But those closest to him noticed the wear. The way his eyes dimmed when no one was looking. The way his hands trembled before a camera. The way silence, once his greatest ally, now began to feel suffocating. He had lived a life of volume without ever using his voice. And now, in the quiet, the things he never said returned to him like ghosts. Regrets he never voiced. Fears he never named. Longings too delicate for the screen. He began writing more, not for the public, but for himself. Letters. Reflections. Fragments. As if he finally realized that if he didn't speak now, his silence would become permanent. He didn't fear death, he feared misunderstanding. That the world would keep laughing at a man who had spent his life trying to be heard. And so he tried, gently, to leave behind clues. Not in characters but in words. He spoke of politics, of humanity, of love. But the world still preferred the cane and the mustache. Still wanted the tumble. Still skipped the tears. Because it's easier to hold on to a laugh than to look into the eyes that created it. But those eyes, they were tired. Not because they had seen too little. But because they had seen too much, and still smiled anyway. There's a particular grief in being applauded for what breaks you. Chaplin knew it well. The scenes where he was kicked, mocked, thrown into walls, the audience laughed. They were supposed to. That was the act. But deep down, Charlie wasn't just acting out comedy. He was reenacting memory. He had been discarded, abandoned, laughed at when he was hurting. And somehow he learned to turn that humiliation into entertainment. Not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. He gave the world his pain dressed as playfulness. And they gave him awards, statues, headlines. But none of it quieted the boy inside who once cried behind a curtain, praying no one would hear. Or worse, that no one would care. As he grew older, the applause echoed differently. Not as affirmation, as distance. Every laugh reminded him of how far he had drifted from his own center. From the quiet child who once just wanted to feel safe. And that's what makes Chaplin's story so tragic. He got everything he thought he needed, and it still didn't make him whole. Because recognition can't heal what no one ever stayed long enough to hold. He had lovers. He had children. But a part of him remained untouched. The part that never got to stop performing. Even in his final films, there's a heaviness. A slowness, a tiredness, not in the performance, in the eyes. As if they were asking, is this what I gave my life for? A world that claps, and never listens. In his final years, Chaplin found himself surrounded by silence, but not the kind he once controlled. This silence was different. Not a stage, not a performance, just time. And with time came reflection. He was older now, slower, less visible. The world had moved on to new stars, new stories. But Chaplin didn't resent it. He watched from afar, smiling with the same mouth that once built empires of laughter, now quieter, heavier. He lived in Switzerland, far from Hollywood, far from the noise, and closer to something he had always longed for, stillness. But even there, the past followed him. Fans wrote letters. Filmmakers paid tribute. People still quoted his lines, though many never watched the films. And in that distance he began to realize, legacy is not always understanding. Sometimes, it's a mirror that reflects only what others want to see. And Chaplin, though grateful, knew what had been lost. Not his fame, but his full self. The man who once fell for laughs, who choreographed heartbreak into comedy, had spent his life telling the world who he was, and the world had only heard the music, not the message. He didn't hate them for it, but there was a sadness in his gaze now, the kind that says, "I gave you all I had. Did you ever look past the mask?" And in that quiet house, surrounded by family and memory, Charlie Chaplin began to write again, not for screens but for the soul. He began revisiting the films. Not out of pride, out of grief. Watching himself dance through hardship, survive cruelty, create joy from nothing, it was almost unbearable. Because behind every performance was a version of himself trying to say something no one ever fully heard. Modern Times, City Lights, The Kid, these weren't just comedies. They were confessions. Wrapped in simplicity, masked with rhythm, but filled with sorrow, longing, and protest. Chaplin had always known that the world preferred palatability over truth. That's why he encoded everything in movement, in expression, in pauses that said more than paragraphs. But now, as he watched his younger self stumble with charm and fall with flair, he no longer saw a character. He saw a boy crying beneath the surface, a man begging to be seen through the laughter. And he wondered if anyone ever had. The critics debated technique. The historians praised innovation. But few ever asked, what was he trying to heal? Because Charlie wasn't performing just to entertain. He was performing to survive. And the audience? They helped. Their laughter saved him in moments he couldn't save himself. But now, looking back, he realized something painful, that the performance never really ended. That long after the curtain fell, he kept smiling for a crowd that no longer clapped. Not because he needed applause, but because he didn't know how else to ask. Is it okay if I'm sad now? Is it okay if I stop pretending? As time passed, his body weakened but his mind remained sharp enough to remember everything. The pain, the fame, the misunderstandings. He received honorary awards, lifetime recognitions, standing ovations from people who weren't even born when his first films were made. And yet, none of it could fix what had always remained broken. Chaplin didn't need statues. He needed someone to ask him what it cost, what it meant to be everyone's joy and no one's truth. He had outlived his myths, outlasted his critics. But in the quiet of late nights, he often stared at his own reflection, older, softer, finally still, and whispered to himself, "You did your best." Because deep down, he knew the audience never owed him anything. But he had always hoped someone would pause long enough to wonder, what was the joke trying to hide? He wasn't bitter. He wasn't even afraid. He was just unfinished. Not in work, in memory, in how the world would remember him. Not just as the man who made it laugh, but as the man who needed to be asked, "And what made you cry?" That's all he ever wanted. Not fame, not perfection, just permission to stop performing. And now, as the lights faded and the final frames of his life began to settle, he made peace with the silence. Because maybe, just maybe, someone would find his truth not in the jokes, but in the eyes that carried them. And if they did, he would know the performance was worth it. Charlie Chaplin didn't die in front of a crowd. There was no stage, no camera rolling, just silence. A kind he had feared his entire life, and finally made peace with. His final moments weren't about legacy or laughter. They were about breath, stillness, presence. The man who once moved the world without saying a word now said nothing, and it was enough. Because in the end, the performance wasn't a mask. It was a map. A way through pain, through poverty, through misunderstanding. He never wanted to be famous. He wanted to be heard. And when words failed, he turned to rhythm. When rhythm failed, he turned to stillness. What the world called comedy was, to him, survival. And what they called silent film was just the only kind of honesty he could afford. As he slipped away, surrounded by the few who knew the man and not just the myth, he didn't need to speak. He had said everything, with his eyes, his falls, his pauses. He left behind more than reels. He left behind echoes. Not of jokes, but of ache. Of a man who turned sorrow into something the world could digest. And though he often feared that no one truly saw him, the truth is, anyone who has ever laughed through tears has already met Charlie Chaplin. Because he didn't invent comedy. He gave it a soul. Now decades later we still play his films. We still smile at the walk, the hat, the cane. We still laugh, and sometimes we cry though we don't always know why. Maybe because we sense it now, the thing he buried so well. The grief behind the grin. The fatigue behind the flair. The question behind the comedy. Chaplin's genius wasn't just in what he created, but in what he concealed. He knew we weren't ready for raw truth, so he dressed it up, made it stumble, made it dance. And in doing so, he gave generations permission to feel without explanation. That's why his legacy endures. Not because of the form, but because of the feeling. His work wasn't timeless because it was perfect. It was timeless because it was honest. Too honest for words. And now, if you sit long enough with his scenes, really sit, you start to hear it. Not the laugh. The silence after. That's where the code is. That's where the truth breathes. Because Charlie wasn't just asking to be remembered. He was asking to be read. Not as a legend. As a letter. One written slowly over a lifetime, in frames and falls and sighs. And now that time has passed, maybe we're finally ready to read it. Not with our eyes, with our ache. With the part of us that knows what it means to keep smiling, when all you really want is to be held. Maybe the final message Chaplin left us wasn't a scene or a script or a quote. Maybe it was this: you can't heal what you hide forever. He taught the world how to laugh without cruelty. How to hurt without turning bitter. How to fall and rise and fall again, not for the spectacle but for the reminder that we're still here. Still trying. Still aching in silence while the music plays. And maybe that's why his eyes linger so long in every frame. Because even as he performed, he was always searching. For someone who wouldn't just clap, but stay after. Someone who wouldn't just laugh, but ask why. That's what remains now. Not a film reel. Not a statue. But a question: what if the people we celebrate the most are the ones we never really knew? What if we've confused entertainment with intimacy? What if the greatest performers are also the most alone? Chaplin didn't want to be remembered as a symbol. He wanted to be remembered as a man. One who gave the world its smile, and asked for nothing in return. But if you've made it this far, maybe now is the time to give him something back. Just one thing. Comment below: I saw the man behind the smile. Let that sentence echo where applause never reached. Because maybe, just maybe, that's all he ever needed.